And joining us now to further this discussion is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol, and David William Pure, political columnist out of Florida. If I could start with you, Tony, please. Your thoughts on that. We're going on 7 days now, Tony. What do you think?
Interesting, they're talking about press TV as a propaganda outlet, as if CNN is not, as if CBS, MSNBC, the big US networks are not propaganda networks. Of course they are, and they put forward the views of the United States elite. We're talking not really about the government necessarily, but we're talking about the owners of America, the people that own the property, own the businesses, own the shares, the billionaires. That they're putting forward the ideas that they are interested in. Of course, with the United States being particularly belligerent around the world, as we've seen with, for example, the attempt to define the 21st century with the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the criminal war on terror. So what they're doing is they're really trying to use their press in order to further their own political ends, which are criminal ends. I think we need to be clear about that. The sorts of invasions that we've seen since the 9/11 attacks, which the 9/11 attacks in no way justify, are the destruction of Iraq, the crippling of Afghanistan, and the turning of the Taliban's regime there into a massive extension of the opium growing and poppy growing. The United States really has got a great cheek calling Iran's state television any kind of propaganda network, because they have been pushing this to the world, and more importantly, actually, I think, to the domestic populations of the West, in Europe and in North America, and the English-speaking world generally. The media is being used as really a cover and as an excuse for this. And all that Press TV is doing, and other networks like the Chinese networks, RT, the Russian network, people like Al Jazeera, etc., is countering this propaganda. Really, they're trying to put out counter narratives, saying, well, look, actually, what you're being told is a very narrow set of views. And I think we need to just understand how grave this detention is. I actually did a quick Google search a few minutes ago on Marzieh Hashemi's name. I made sure I'd spelled it correctly on the Google News, and Google are censoring Marzieh's story. If you put it in there, there was virtually nothing about this story, even though there are a few stories in the Western press about this, most of them, this detention, most of them saying, for example, reports say, so they're putting riders on that in their headlines. Of course, there's no real contention about whether or not Marzieh has been detained. We know she has, and the Google and these social media platforms. I think this is potentially. Now, I have no absolute evidence for this, but the circumstantial evidence from doing my Google search tells me this may be an exercise, in fact, in seeing how much that they can limit and control the coverage of this story, because it's been absolutely minimal here in the West. A few reluctant articles. And very, very little proper coverage of it. And certainly it's been down the bulletins. So in other words, not high. If this had been somebody like the BBC's Fiona Bruce, who is now the new chair of BBC's Question Time programme. She's been a news presenter for many years on the BBC's networks, mainly on BBC One and BBC World. You would see an absolute furore. How dare you arrest this person who is such an important person in Britain? But we've seen virtually nothing, little bits in the bottom of the headlines. So that's why I was shocked to see Google News censoring this story. And I think we all need to be aware that some of these big, powerful, big tech, the tech giants, we just simply cannot trust them on this. And it may even be that some of the other services, such as, your Twitters and the Facebooks, may also be attempting to dumb this story down, to get it so that people aren't looking. Now, I know for a fact, talking to journalists in my home city of Bristol, that many of them use Google News the whole time. So they may be searching for this story, using Google News and finding virtually nothing. And this is incredible, a week after this happened. In fact, it even took, didn't it, 3 days to actually get confirmation from the Americans, who are very, very reluctant to help people understand what had happened to her. She had just disappeared for a few days, and it took a while to actually even get the story confirmed. So I think we need to just be really, really, I find it fascinating, but also horrifying that our media can have such double standards, hypocritical double standards. Its own presenters, journalists, journalism in its own country or its own part of the world is considered important, whereas any kind of country which may be a rival or have different ways of doing things. I mean, for example, Iran has a very much more mature attitude to banking and banks than the West does, where there's interest and debt is starting to kill off whole entire economies. The Iranians are seen to be the bad guys in this. Actually, that's not the case at all. They're showing you in Iran and in Tehran are showing up the West, and that's why I think this cowardly provocation has happened. It's a kind of gangster tactic, and it makes me ashamed to be living in the West where these kinds of tactics are considered acceptable. In fact, a provocation towards what? Are they expecting the Western journalists, etc., to be arrested in Iran or in Qatar or somewhere like that? I don't think that'll happen, because I think the people in Tehran, in Russia, in China are far more mature than to rise to this very, I think, an intellectual assault really on the world's journalism and world journalists.
And Tony,
I don't think you guys will rise to the bait, because you have the maturity to see just how cowardly this act has been.
And if I could swing over really quick, Tony, over to Mr. David William Pierre. David, Tony touched on some, really interesting points there. One being, okay, as far as, calling Press TV a propaganda outlet, I'm glad that Tony brought that up, because here you have a Fox News guy in the White House, and then you have a far left CNN guy standing there, Jim Acosta in front of him, laying into him, very, very critical of him, and then the Fox News guy tries to kick him out of the building, actually does. He's successful in censoring him, kicking him out of the building, and then a district judge says that is not lawful. It's illegal. He has a right to be critical. Just because his views don't concur with your views as a journalist, he is exempt from your political game. Why wasn't the same protection afforded to our co-worker and dear colleague here, Marzieh Hashemi?
Well, I think you answered your own question there, but the reason is because Marzieh Hashemi is from Iran, and even though she's a U.S. citizen, they're not giving her the same respect as a journalist that they would American journalists here in the U.S. on Fox News, CNN, and other outlets that are considered to be legitimate outlets, whereas they are starting to attack more and more the alternative news media, as well as Russia Today and Press TV and other sources of news. And censorship is growing by leaps and bounds almost every day. But I mean, this is quite disturbing what they're doing to Marzieh Hashemi, because they are basically holding her without charge. They're saying that she's a material witness to a crime, an unspecified crime, and that's not the way you would treat a material witness, even if you thought that she might not show up for trial. They would at least keep her in a hotel room or something of that sort in a civilized conditions. But they're treating her as if she's a criminal, and it sounds as if, from what I'm hearing, that it's almost as if they're torturing her. They're keeping her in a cold cell, giving her not very much in the way of warm clothing, not feeding her, and things of this sort. And what all of this shows to me is that what the U.S. does, what our foreign policy is overseas, eventually it comes back to haunt us. Eventually our foreign policy will come back to the U.S. and will haunt American citizens, and American citizens will be treated just as we are treating people in foreign countries, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and any number of other places where we're violating international law, including Venezuela and Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua. All of this is going to come back. and it is coming back, and it's coming back very, very viciously. I happen to have grown up in what now seems to be a very unique period of time when we had a what was called a loyal opposition. People could speak out. They could speak out against policies. They could speak out against the government. They could speak out against war. They could speak out against things that they disagreed with that the government is doing. But this is no longer becoming acceptable. And unfortunately, most of the American people, the majority of them, seem to be just sitting back on their couch and accepting this in a very passive way, and even agreeing with it. They've been completely brainwashed by our own propaganda, which keeps saying that the United States is under attack by all these evil forces out in the world, which are really asymmetrical compared to the might and the power of the United States of America. It's as if the U.S. is just a big cowardly bully that has to shove its weight around and is afraid of any little threat. How Marzieh Hashemi could be any kind of a threat to the American people, and how press TV could be any kind of a threat is really kind of beyond belief. I mean, you guys do a very good job of reporting the news.
I didn't mean to cut you off, David. Let me just, so we don't have a lot of time. I want to continue this discussion. And just
the role of the media isn't necessarily understood around the West so well as it should be. There's a former military analyst for the United Nations who goes by the name of the Saker. He's got his own website based in Iceland, a very good place to put your website if you want to make sure it stays up. They've got the special laws in Iceland to stop censorship of the internet. But he's made a really important point, which is that the media today is very much part of the war machine. It's changed. And in fact, I can remember working at the BBC in 1989, 1991. I could see it changing. What was going on at the BBC was changing. Some of the best producers, when I say the best, I mean people who are independent-minded, have also got a kind of social justice mission, people with a conscience, knowing that the audience will be interested in missions of social justice and stories of social justice, seeing some of them removed and seeing a new breed come along. In fact, the BBC were even taking accountants and retraining them to become producers and editors. So this was the style at the BBC in the late 80s and early 1990s under the Director General John Burt. And it was a complete change in the organisation, which had been much more professional beforehand. And what they would do is always make sure they had balanced reporting. So where there were credible views, even if it was a wide span of opinion, they would make sure that all those views, one way or another, were reported. Now, by no means were they perfect. In fact, the government did interfere in the BBC quite a bit. Ever since it started, it has been. But there's a real dive in the 1990s and certainly after the 9/11 attacks in the professional standards of the BBC. So we see nowadays in warfare around about, this is what the Saker has pointed out, 5% actual fighting, that is using guns and tanks and soldiers, around about 15% economic warfare, and that is sanctions. That begins with, now whenever you hear the word sanctions, a little switch in your brain should flick and you should be thinking economic warfare, because that's what sanctions are. They're an attempt to subdue another country using economic means and to strangle and stifle them, to stop trade with them, this sort of thing. But 80% of modern warfare, this is what the Saker has pointed out, is information warfare. That is to stop your own population knowing what they're up to. For example, in Britain, just over the last 2 months or so, we've had a scandal of something called the Integrity Initiative, Orwellian named organisation, that's been being paid millions of government money to smear the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, and also to encourage Russiagate. That is to say, to try to put out information to foreign news desks and all on Twitter and on social media all over the place, saying that the Russians interfered in the Trump election. Now, if you look into it, you'll find, in fact, the opposite is true. It was the Democratic Party and the Hillary Clinton camp within the Democratic Party that did that. And in fact, there was a whistleblower called Seth Rich within the Democratic Party that blew the whistle and said that Hillary Clinton was fixing the nomination for the Democratic Party, and Bernie Sanders was cheated of the nomination. In fact, he would probably be president now if she hadn't cheated. And then Seth Rich was found dead. So what you've got is information warfare and lies being told by the mass media, and that sort of thing now being encouraged with British government money through little organisations like this Integrity Initiative. So warfare nowadays is very much on our TV screens, and that's why journalism has suffered so much. But Marzieh was a really good journalist. She had a fantastic grasp of the issues. Well, she still does, actually. And, you know, she could think on her feet really fast. She asked me all sorts of awkward questions, which I always enjoyed. And she's a formidable intellect. That's why they want her out of the way.
We're almost out of time, Tony. I want to get David William Pierre's last comments in there. David, I want to put the last question to you. I mean, you mentioned, actually, Tony was alluding to what you mentioned earlier with respect to the politicization of news around the world. Well, my question to you, you very well know, we sit here as, anchors. We read facts off of an auto cue. We engage in a couple of interviews. We sometimes have some rolling coverage, but, we're also fed facts by a lot of our coworkers. We do not develop, make, or write foreign or domestic policy. We're not politicians. Why are we to be held account for those that do?
Well, you shouldn't be, and there should be freedom in the press, and there should be room for all sorts of views, even the views of people the United States government doesn't necessarily like, such as Iran and such as Venezuela and other countries. But a lot of people aren't aware of this, but the United States has been under a state of emergency, a basically martial law, since 9/11. And I was just looking it up. I'm sorry to look down at my notes, but Donald Trump just signed Proclamation 7463, which was issued by George Bush after 9/11, which suspended the U.S. Constitution in many regards, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and it also gave authority to the FISA courts and a lot of other secret government actions, torture, extraordinary rendition, holding people without charge, calling people enemy combatant and so forth. So, I mean, it really is terrible, but we have a long history of this. This is not like this is just something new either. During World War I, in 1917, we had the Espionage Act, and then followed by that